I'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for coming out. My name is Amanda Folson, and today I'm going to be talking to you about open source for closed source companies. So just a little bit of background about me. Like I said, my name is Amanda. I'm a developer advocate at GitLab. Developer advocacy is basically a crazy Venn diagram of sales, marketing, product management, recruiting, engineering, technical writing, kind of whatever they happen to need, I happen to do at any given time. I am pretty much a professional tinkerer, and I owe my career to open source software. So just to get into my background a little bit, I grew up around computers. My dad was a developer in the 90s, so I kind of had always been around it. We built my first computer when I was about 7, and it was running Windows 95. And I spent an obscene amount of time playing Minesweeper and Solitaire because that was just the greatest thing to 7-year-old me. Got a few random games when you're 7 years old, like you're into dinosaurs and stuff, so I had some dinosaur games that I would play and stuff like that. And then started getting into chat, and in particular I found a thing called Game. Any of you remember that? It's now, I think, Pigeon and libpurple client, archaic stuff, and was trying to figure out, they had this thing that said compile from source, and I was like, what does that even mean? And I reached out to a developer and I was like, so what is this? Because they had all their screen names listed out, and he's like, oh, you want to compile from source? And I was like, what does that mean? He's like, well, maybe you don't want to compile from source. And that was my first open source experience. So in middle school, I was making websites and things, and was also into Neopets for a while, and was kind of frustrated with some of the things that would go on in the game. And at this point, I'm like 9 or 10 years old, and I'm like, you know what? I could make a better Neopets, because of course, 10 years old, I know everything, right? So I found PHP, and I started to make my Neopets clone. Still have that code base. It's atrocious, but hilarious to look at now, especially since it's like early PHP 4. And continued doing PHP, and eventually found this cool thing called IRC. And IRC introduced me to a whole world of developers. I don't even remember which network I was on at the time, but it was pretty life-changing. So I eventually got involved in IRC development. So went from PHP to starting to do a little bit of C programming now. Still kept up with the PHP stuff. Now I was doing some more low-level stuff. Started hacking on some IRC services and submitting patches and things like that. And through that kind of led me to some other things. I discovered web servers. I was like, so now I need to host my websites somewhere so other people can see them without doing like crazy tunneling through router sorts of things, port forwarding and all of that. And just kind of kept along that path, and eventually got a job as a tech writer. So was working with even more utilities and things, and actually had to sort of become the expert on them in order to document them. And prior to working at GitLab, I worked at a company called PagerDuty, and kind of continued the trend. Worked at Linode prior to that. Kind of continued the trend with getting exposed to different software things, and I definitely believe that has led me to where I'm at today, and now I get to travel around the world and give talks just like this one. But again, I simply would not be here without open source software. That's the reason I'm actually standing here today. So what is open source? Lots of definitions for this in the open source world. I tend to define it as releasing source code under a permissive license for the greater good. Allowing for re-release. There are a ton of different licenses. OSI and GitHub both break these down pretty well. So if you're looking for licensing, not sure where to get started, even though GitHub's a competitor to my current employer, I recommend checking out their documentation on different licensing, because it is actually very good. You're sure to find something that's going to work for your project. Even if you're worried about intellectual property law, there's a bunch of different licensing that supports that. Licensing is also necessary if you want people to actually use your product. There are actually companies that have policies that forbid them from using software that does not have a permissive license. And technically, by not releasing your code with a license, you're basically, yeah, it's out there for people to use, but you're not really giving them permission to use it, even if you put it on something like GitLab or GitHub. So putting it out there kind of allows people to adapt it to suit their needs, and it facilitates global maintenance and collaboration. How many of you are contributing to open source software right now? Awesome. How many of you contribute to open source software that has contributors from all over the world? Cool, yeah, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. Really easy to maintain and collaborate across the world. people usually do this for free, and offers some more diverse opinions than any one particular company can sustain. All of this can be done at a global scale. You can go from 5 people to 5,000 people through open source. Some people are doing this in their spare time. Other times it's people who are looking to make changes to a tool that they use at work. There's a whole bunch of reasons why people get involved in this, but very few companies can hire the amount of people working on some of these projects. You look at stuff like Drupal's a great example. There are thousands of people contributing to Drupal. There's no way that the Drupal Association could employ every single one of those people to work on Drupal full-time. So that's one of my favorite examples. What open source isn't. So a lot of people think that giving away the source code is giving away their bread and butter. And in some cases, that is right. In a lot of cases, it's not so right. So you're actually giving it away in exchange for out-of-house development. Like I said, usually that's free. And all you need to do is provide a little bit of guidance in order to get that to happen. And it's giving it away in hopes that someone else finds it useful and allowing people to contribute their own patches and bug fixes, or even just fork the project entirely to do their own thing. Any of you follow Node.js? Yeah, so that got split off into a thing, another project which became popular, and they're now merged back in. So things like that happen in the open source world all the time. Open source is also not giving away your business. Anybody familiar with Red Hat? They kind of do the open source thing, giving it all away, and yet they're a $2 billion a year company, at least. Last time I checked. They're doing all right. So, other examples, Rackspace released OpenStack. They're still $1 billion company. They're doing okay. OpenStack is an integral part of their infrastructure, but it's not everything. They kind of tout their fanatical support and stuff like that. Parts of Windows and Azure are now starting to become open source, which is an interesting move by Microsoft. Microsoft is still mostly okay. They're doing all right. And you're kind of exchanging your source code for rapid development. This is especially true at larger companies and projects that have a little bit of traction already. Some of these projects are getting thousands of commits per month, some hundreds per day. So you can kind of get a little crazy with this and not necessarily put yourself out of business. And also, never underestimate the power of lazy people. A lot of people can't or won't host some of this stuff themselves. So people freak out about giving stuff away, and never underestimate the value of people's laziness, because that's a thing. So I've given this talk a few times. I obviously work at an open source company. I talk to people about open source a lot, and people, they get really aggressive. They're like, no, we can't do that. And I'm kind of like, well, why not? And they come up with things like, oh, we'll lose control of the project. Sometimes that happens, more often than not. Not really true. We'll go out of business. I hear that a lot. Well, maybe, depending on how you do it, but probably not. Our competitors will steal our stuff. So this is actually one of the interesting things about GitLab, is that if you really want to see our product roadmap, you can. It's all out there, out in the open. GitHub can go look at it if they want it. And they probably do, because any good company doing competitive analysis would. But we don't care. I mean, a lot of these things are not new ideas. They're not novel. We plan to do them, but it's not anything that anyone else couldn't come up with. When I worked at PagerDuty, here's an example of something that you maybe would not want to open source. We had this messaging pipeline. So if you're not familiar with PagerDuty, they wake you up when things break. So they do on-call rotation management, alerting, and things like that. The alerting pipeline, the pipeline that the messages actually travel through, is actually pretty robust. It has to be highly available. We are alerting people when their stuff breaks, so there's like a huge, there's a lot of pressure for them to keep their pipeline always online, and there's a lot that goes into that you maybe wouldn't want to open source. But things like web panels and stuff like that, release that stuff to let other people kind of fix their own pain points. And believe me, even if you're not hearing about it, people do have pain points with your website. This is my favorite. This is my absolute favorite. People who tell me that there's no value to open source software, and they're running like their e-commerce WordPress website on Apache and stuff. And they're like, oh, well, there's no value. It's like, oh, really? So the millions of dollars a year that you make using open source software isn't valuable to you? Oh, okay, that's fine. And the ultimate irony is that they'll say it on social media or something, and all of those sites, of course, are making use of Rails or PHP or some sort of open source software. So it's just ironic, pretty much all the way down. And if you hear this sort of thing, I encourage you to challenge people on it, because a lot of people, it's not that they're trying to be rude or trying to be mean. They just don't know any better. They don't actually understand how much open source software they use. I mean, even, if you're using a proprietary operating system like Windows or OS X, there's still open source software in there. You can actually pull up licensing information on all of the stuff that's in there. So a lot of people just really don't know about that, and we have a lot of work to do to educate people on that. Another one, we have to hire someone to maintain it if we open source it. As well, maybe, but still probably cheaper than hiring a bunch of in-house engineers. If you're getting access to several hundred people who are interested in your product and you don't have to pay any of them, that's actually pretty good. Even though you're not paying them, you should still treat them respectfully, though people kind of lose sight of that. Oh, you're not really working for me, so I don't care about your opinions. That's also bad. So don't do that. Please treat your contributors well, because they are nice people, by giving you their time. And you might have to hire a community manager or somebody who's just there to kind of give guidance to the community and kind of put so that's similar to my role, where my job is to get product feedback back into the product from people out in the field. Do a lot of that. So you might have to hire someone like me to kind of facilitate that communication. I'm still cheaper than 5,000 developers. So this is a valid concern. What about my bottom line? Yeah, that is something that you need to consider when you're talking about open source software, but truly great ideas are going to be built on. Even if you're not open sourcing something, someone is going to make an open source version of it, and that's actually exactly what GitLab did. There were a bunch of tools that do similar things to what GitLab does. Not a single one of them was open source, and the ultimate irony of it is that all of those companies that are doing that talk about how much they love open source. None of them are open source. So there are people who will probably leech your idea. They will steal your source code. I can't even tell you how many times I've seen someone remove the licensing from all of the source code files and replace their name in all of that. It happens. It's a stupid thing. It's an obnoxious thing that people do. But those projects really aren't that successful. I mean, has anyone ever heard of one of those projects that's done something like that being ultra successful and replacing the product that it ultimately ripped off? I don't think it happens. So people are afraid of losing money, which is a healthy fear, but there's more to the product than the code. So you look at something like, going back to Rackspace, that's a great example. They released OpenStack, and that's a huge thing, and Rackspace doesn't even really work on it that much anymore. There's a bunch of other people who are contributing to that. But they're not out of business, and like I said, they kind of offer an entire ecosystem. So yeah, you could set up your own infrastructure, but Rackspace is their kind of value proposition is, let us worry about all of that, and oh, by the way, in doing that, you'll get access to our support, which is top notch, and things like that. So there's a whole lot more going on there than just releasing some source code, and a lot of people just don't take that into consideration. A lot of the products that come up from projects like that, they make waves, but they tend to not make more waves than anything that you're doing. If you were there first, feel free to intrude. If you were there first, you're in a prime position to stay number one when it comes to something like that. They might overtake you, but if that something like that happens, there's an opportunity to reel things back into your project and nurture the new project and the new community, and that's actually kind of what the Node community started to do. So if you're selling a SaaS-based thing or some sort of platform, you're kind of selling the ecosystem around all of that, and not just some code. This is another one of my favorites. Is, oh, someone will steal my idea. Well, the unfortunate thing is that your idea is probably not all that unique. Every now and then there's a unique idea, but in the case of GitLab and PagerDuty and Linode, all companies I've worked at, nothing any of those companies is doing is a new idea. I got news for you. It's just not. So you might be reinventing the wheel a little bit. You might have a little bit of a pivot from what someone else is doing, but in general, the concepts are probably the same. People don't really care about your idea as much as you think they're going to. It might be your passion. You might invest your entire life into that project, but that doesn't mean that other people are going to. and other people are probably not going to be as passionate. And if they were, they would build it themselves. And value is ultimately subjective. If you're, photo sharing was a thing before Instagram. Search engines existed before Google. Never underestimate the power of marketing and positioning when it comes to things like this. So, you might be ripping off someone's idea, someone else might be ripping off your idea, but marketing and how you position that idea goes a long, long way. So how open source can kind of help you in addition to some of the things that I mentioned. It allows people to try before they buy, and a lot of people like this, especially among the tech crowd. They don't want to commit to buying something without actually making sure it's going to meet their needs. Open sourcing software really allows them to try before they buy very in-depth. So more than just a 30-day trial. I don't know, if you work at an enterprise company or even, I'm sure this happens at smaller companies too, 30 days is not necessarily enough time to try something. In the case of PagerDuty, 30-day trial, you might get a few pages or something like that, but ultimately, you may not get the information that you need out of something like that. So open source would actually help with something like that. And people don't necessarily want to talk to sales reps in order to get some of the information that they need. It's a lot easier to see something for yourself in an environment that you can control versus a demo that someone's giving you where things are kind of programmed to look their best. So if people know what they're getting, they'll tell you how it will or won't work for you, and you kind of win anyway. You either get product improvements by people telling you, hey, this isn't going to work for me, or you get hopefully some revenue. Hopefully it will work out for them, and you will get some revenue out of that. And there are a bunch of different models. I'm not really going to go into the revenue models, but we're all familiar, the support contracts and things like that for open source revenue models. One size doesn't fit all, and one of the great selling points is that open source kind of allows people to size things on their own terms. What works for you is not necessarily going to work for someone else. So as one person, for me, going back to OpenStack, OpenStack for me is overkill as a single person. Maybe I just need a Zenbox somewhere, or maybe I just need Vagrant or something like that. But I have the freedom to explore all of my options. All of these things are open source. I can figure out what I'm going to need, and that's ultimately what I'm trying to solve here is my problem, right? As a result, I also end up learning about these products and can help people find solutions for themselves. So if you open source things and kind of let people try it and get into your ecosystem and things like that, eventually you can turn those people into people who will either sell your product or tell other people why they shouldn't use your product. So you can, it's a kind of a fine line to ride, but ultimately it's good. If your product isn't going to work for people, you should know that. You should know why your product is not working for people. You'll recall I mentioned working on some IRC services earlier, and that started as making modules for functionality that I needed. And eventually those things got put back into those services, and now people can take advantage of all of that just because I put it out there and because they put the source code out there, and now everybody kind of wins in that situation. I think my favorite thing that actually ended up in that was I made an 8-ball service, so you could ask IRC services 8-ball questions and it would respond, and for whatever reason they decided to put that in the source code. I don't know why you would ever need that as part of your main package, but it's one of those things, people have the freedom to load and unload that module now if they so desire. And people should be able to tweak things. Their changes may even benefit you, so one size doesn't fit all, but one size can sure fit many. So you never know when one person's little tweak is actually going to be beneficial to literally thousands of other people who are using your product. And it'll fit many more if your users are able to kind of establish quorum on what they need. This got out of order. All right, I'll talk about this. Downside to kind of some of these things is people kind of tend to create silos. And I'm a big anti-silo person, so too often we're kind of stuck in our own silos and develop these huge blind spots to our products. And open source kind of allows people to break out of those silos and allows people to learn new things, learn about your product, learn about competing products, and kind of develop a better ecosystem for everybody. So a lot of companies, they will send developers into a room and be like, okay, well, go build this thing. And not necessarily put in the product research that they need and the competitive analysis that they need in order to make informed decisions. Well, if you're open sourcing stuff, you can get that information quicker and probably easier as well. So, trying to stay ahead of the market can result in some pretty serious tunnel vision. And I definitely encourage people to not get stuck in their silo. We know what we want, but we don't always know what customers want. And even if they give us feedback, do they act on it? How many people have received customer feedback that, has never been acted on? Yeah, a few. Surprised people raise their hands for that. Letting customers have control over their product direction is actually a really good thing, and they are probably going to know more about their needs than you do. So don't try to pretend like you know everything, you know the solution, the magical solution. Let them have control and kind of give them what they need in order to succeed. Because sooner or later, someone is going to make an open source alternative to your product. OpenOffice, LibreOffice was the answer to Microsoft Office. And they're great. They're open source social networks. You can actually spin up your own Facebook clone if you want to do that, your own Twitter clone. There are actually new Twitter clones appearing every day. I swear I find a new library or package that basically allows you to build Twitter pretty regularly. There are open source operating systems that can look and feel like any Windows or Apple box. Anybody using an open source operating system? Yes. Okay. And these projects have market share, so you may as well get that market share from the start. Might as well be you. So let's say I have failed to convince you to open source your software. It happens. It's a thing. Sometimes it doesn't always make sense. Before I worked at GitLab, like I said, I worked at PagerDuty, and PagerDuty is a SaaS-based product. It's a closed source company, but they did a lot of really cool things internally that were kind of pro-open source, open information. So not going to talk to you about GitLab. They do all things open. I'm going to talk to you actually about PagerDuty, my last job, and some of the really neat things that they did internally that really helped the company a lot. Like I said, they'd have been stupid to kind of open source their ultra-reliable alerting pipeline. That's something that is actually a competitive advantage, so it doesn't make sense to open source that. But some of the things they did were pretty cool. So one of the only companies, either public or private, that I've ever seen that has a wiki that's actually maintained. They did the wiki thing extremely well. Everything was up to date. Teams knew where to go. I, as someone on the product team, was able to go see what the ops team was up to. I could go see the new sales deck and use that as part of my on-the-road pitches if I was actually doing a sales call or something like that. So it was great to actually have all of that. A lot of meetings were open to the entire company. Not everything, but pretty much meetings that were not considered, secret. So some of the C-level executives would have private meetings and stuff like that. But for the most part, you could sit in on any of those, even some of the meetings about finances. So I, as an employee with stock options, could go into a finance meeting and figure out how well the company was doing. And that was important to me. And that should be important to anybody who has stock options at their company. So that was great. We also had this concept of demo days. So if you were working on something in the product or outside of the product, just working on something that helped you do your job better, you're given an opportunity to present that to the entire company. And what we found is that a lot of the demos that were being given were things that were relevant to our customer base. People were building in little features and little scripts and things here and there that we could then, give to people, and it was actually beneficial to us and also to people outside of the company. This is nothing novel. They had monthly all-hands meetings where they'd get the entire company together and go over some of this information. They were very open with the information, from the C-levels all the way down. Like I said, going over things like financials and how we were doing with funding rounds and things like that. Where we were, down to how much money we had in the bank, and if we never made another dollar, how long it would take the company to die based on how much money we had in the bank. Things like that. Super, super valuable information. They also implemented, they were kind of anti-meeting. So all meetings over 30 minutes required an agenda, and anybody could see that agenda, unless it was one of the closed meetings, like I said. They also let people attend trainings. So even if you were not on a product manager, I was a product manager, even if you weren't a PM, you could still attend PM training and things like that. So it allowed everybody to kind of be on the same page and understand where everybody was coming from. The executives also had office hours, and you could pretty much go in there and ask them anything you wanted, and 9 times out of 10 they'd tell you, unless it was something that was kind of reserved. You couldn't go in there and ask about other employees and things like that and their private lives, obviously, but common sense rules apply, of course. But yeah, you could pretty much ask them whatever you wanted. So, had to blur this out because I no longer work there, unfortunately, and I'm not about to give this information out now that I no longer have permission to do so. But this was actually my Kanban board, and you'll note that there are two people. So I am the Lego helmet right here. There are two people who are not me on this Kanban board, and both of them are people who just saw my Kanban board and were like, hey, this is actually relevant to something I'm working on, so I'm going to help you out. And they would just grab those things. And anybody could do that. You were encouraged to do stuff like that. If you saw something that you could do, you were welcome to take it. And it was great. It took a ton off my plate. You can see over here the red line at the top of that first column means that I had way too many things. I had more than 10 things in there, so my Kanban board was angry. It was pretty angry at me. By virtue of having that there, they were allowed to step in. And the guy with the green avatar is kind of an interesting story. So we call him Captain Intern. He was an intern on a team that answered to somebody completely outside of my department, had nothing to do with what I was working on. And he asked what I needed help with after seeing the board was overloaded. And so I gave him some simple things. I mean, Captain Intern was 19 at the time and, didn't have a whole lot of experience with a bunch of stuff. So I gave him some easy stuff. And he was like, you know what? I'm more interested in doing some of these code samples that you're working on, because I had a bunch of code samples for SDK documentation and all that stuff. And so eventually Captain Intern started learning how to code and started taking coding tasks off of my Kanban board and taking care of them. And now he's able to do some basic stuff now to this day. That was about a year ago that he started learning all that, and now he's actually on his way to becoming a developer. So he accidentally found a career because he stumbled upon some random crap on a Kanban board and wanted to learn how to code, basically. So it was kind of cool. But it wouldn't have happened if he probably wouldn't have gotten there as quickly anyway if he hadn't have had access to this open information here inside the company. So what you just saw is kind of a great example of cross-team functionality. Anybody can contribute to anything. And I'm not saying that anybody should be CEO for a day, frankly. I don't know why you'd want to be, but there are people out there who would love to take over a company for a day, and I'm not advocating for that by any means. Not by any means. So it is okay to have need-to-know things, just like it's okay to not necessarily release your bread and butter. But you should definitely be giving back if you're using open source software and not open sourcing your own stuff, just as an aside. The teams kind of own specific projects, so that particular board, I had final say in all of that stuff. They weren't allowed to close tasks, only I could close tasks, so I could make sure that those things were done properly or in the way that they needed to be done. But, I established some guidelines. It's like, okay, if you want to contribute to I owned the documentation and all that stuff, you want to contribute to that, you're welcome to contribute to that. But I was responsible for basically keeping the bug queue organized and all of that stuff. So people follow the rules. So if you establish the rules, people will follow them as part of their contribution. More often than not, people don't want to inconvenience you. Every now and then you'll find someone who's like, yeah, I want you to use my workflow, but since you're the project owner, you get to say, haha, actually no. And this was actually, I think, one of the greatest things that happened. And this is one of those things that I will take with me from job to job. Learning from failure. They were phenomenal at learning from failure. So, I mean, if you deployed something that knocked over production, if you had a bad deploy, it was pretty much guaranteed you weren't going to get fired for that unless you did something just completely negligent. And that's kind of rare these days. A lot of people get a lot of crap for a bad deploy or something, but you know what? It happens. It happens to everybody. So someone else will make a mistake, but everybody gets to learn from that. And they had this concept of blameless postmortems. So nobody was blamed. You might be named in the postmortem, be like, so-and-so deployed at such and such time, and the build broke, test passed, but, ultimately something spiked in our monitoring or whatever, and, we had to roll back. And, nobody would get fired for stuff like that. But everybody got to learn, like, hey, here's the lesson that everybody learned from this mistake. So I'm a huge fan of the blameless postmortem. No one is blamed. No one is attacked. No one's fired. I actually really enjoyed that. These failure opportunities were just great opportunities for everybody to learn and improve and things like that. So really loved the Linux postmortem. So what else can you open up? Even if you're not going to open up your SaaS, why can't you open up your documentation? And we did just that when I worked there. We had everything on Jekyll. You could one-click deploy your own instance of our documentation if you wanted to. And what we found is that people actually started contributing to that. We just did it. We didn't really advertise that we did it, but people found it. We had a section in there where you could add your own projects, things built on top of our API to our documentation and kind of showcase what you were doing. And people started doing it just completely on their own without us even advertising it. So even something as simple as documentation, it's not a secret. Go ahead and open that up. And libraries and tools and little things like that, everybody makes little scripts and things to do little one-off things. You never know when someone's going to find that useful. I, at one point in time, made a script that would allow you to play a video, set up VLC, play a video, and broadcast that for people to go in and watch the stream. Wasn't for anything sinister, was not breaking the law. It was actually a demo that I had done. But people found that useful. People were like, I want to give my demos this way. I want people to just open up VLC and put in a URL and just have everybody be at the exact same spot in the demo. So open source that, and people started using it just completely on accident. SDKs, things like that, why not open that up? The people who are using the SDK are going to know a lot more about what they need than you do, most likely. Not always true, but more often than not it is. Things like frameworks and modules, go ahead and open those up. Using OpenStack, OpenStack is kind of frameworky in a way that it allows you to kind of design your own infrastructure. Why not open that up and let other people take advantage of that? They're probably not going to be able to do the work that you're doing when it comes to stuff like that. So hopefully I was able to convince you, or at least give you ways to bring some open source principles into your workplace or into your company. I would love to talk to you more about this, so feel free to reach out to me, and thank you so much. Are there any questions? Turn it back.
Yeah, so you talked a little bit about the things that helped you do open source inside. So, sort of for managing documentation, things like that. Were there some tools that you would recommend, beyond the standard ones that we probably all use? But what are Kanban Board, documentation sharing? What were some tools that you found helpful?
Yeah, so the Kanban Board, unfortunately, was part of Jira, which is not open source, but there are open source things similar to it. If you look for open source Jira, open source Confluence, and things like that, you'll find pretty much an open source version of every Atlassian tool that exists. So Kanban Board was really helpful. I didn't necessarily adhere to Kanban principles. I won't go too far into that, but just having those tiles of to-dos was super helpful for managing little one-off projects. Didn't make sense for everything, especially for long-term things. For the long-term stuff, tended to do more long form, would put it in a doc or something like that and just give people access to that doc as needed. As far as documentation, we were using Jekyll for that, so pretty easy to get started with Jekyll and allow people to kind of do their own documentation. It was super easy for us to maintain too, because we could just slap that up on Heroku. Now you can even put that up on GitHub or GitLab pages, no problem. Yep.
So mostly what you talked about was IP concerns. I guess what do you have to say about people with security complaints? If we open source a project, people will then be able to drill down and find exploits, or that the community contributing, they might create bugs, they might create exploits.
So that's a distinct possibility, and that's where having code reviews and things like that comes into play. So I would never just blindly merge something unless I was absolutely sure I knew what it did. And a lot of these larger open source projects have people that are looking for stuff like that, so it's really easy for them to see. For little one-person shops, you might not always have that luxury, but usually, as developers, we tend to know other people who wouldn't mind looking over things like that. As far as open sourcing and being concerned about people exploiting things or finding exploits, in all honesty, people are trying to do that anyway, regardless of open source. Look at your weblog sometime. Like, people are already doing all sorts of crazy crap. Like, I really don't think open sourcing software. There are definitely people who are going to look for things like that, but I definitely think that more often than not, people are looking for that because they want a bounty of some sort. They're not necessarily doing it because they want to exploit it. They're looking at it because they want money, or then. Sometimes not even money, just like recognition, t-shirts and stuff like that. So I've definitely worked with people who have said, like, hey, here's our policy on finding security vulnerabilities. We'll give you $1,000 for each one you find. Of course, we get to vet them or whatever. Some people, they said, hey, we can't afford to pay you, but we'll send you a t-shirt or something. And a lot of people are good with that too. And they have like a leaderboard. So I wouldn't necessarily let security concerns dictate whether or not you open source something, unless you're dealing with a lot of like really sensitive financial transactional stuff. And even then, you might actually benefit from open source.
That's kind of my point. Is I think by releasing it to everyone, they might surreptitiously find fixes for you.
Yeah, so that can definitely go either way. Sometimes people will find things and tell you before they release it to everybody. Sometimes people are just looking at it to be asses, and you're never going to know which is which. But like I said, I mean, look at your weblog sometime. Like, people are already trying to SQL inject stuff, cross-site scripting. Like, that's already happening. It's already automated. It's out there. People are doing it. Any other questions?
Yep. Are the slides going to be available?
Yes.
Sweet.
Yep. Put them online. There's also going to be a video on YouTube.
Awesome.
So they will upload that at some point. All right. Any other questions? Yep.
Yeah. Do you see any IP issues internationally when open source is being exploited?
Yeah. So I can't remember. It might have been an EU law. I don't remember offhand, but yeah, that does come up sometimes. Some of the IP law can get a little hairy when it gets international, and there was a specific statute regarding open source licensing. There is a license, and I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank on which one it is, that is not good if you plan on releasing code to countries, and I want to say the EU, because there's like some provision about like data privacy or something in there that doesn't jive well with some of the other things that they have. So if you are looking to get into open source, definitely talk to a lawyer, because I am not one, and someone who knows IP law, technical IP law, very, very well. You will have to pay a small fortune to talk to that person, but it will absolutely be worth it, because it will cost you more to deal with the aftermath of not doing so. All right. Any other ones? Cool. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.